Well, there's a nice change from last week. Instead of sitting under a glowing heater looking like I'm literally in hell, thank you for those who commented and said it didn't look like it'd gone in the right direction. Now it's sunshine. Still Oslo, still sunshine, which is good. Still sunshine. Wasn't sunshine before, a little bit of sunshine. It is well and truly turning into autumn here though, so it has been a little bit miserable this week. I seem to have timed it well today. So what are we at the moment? 15 degrees Celsius apparently, which is not too bad. This is the last one I'll be doing from Oslo for a very long time as well, because I will be heading off into another part of Scandinavia come Monday. Now I'm going to talk about that in a moment. First of all, this week I went to Javazone, and Javazone was kind of interesting. So this was in Oslo. It was in the same stadium that we normally run the NDC events in June every year. Still my favourite conference every year, the NDC ones. So in some ways it was very similar. It was like a similar kind of layout, and they had all the vendor stands and food stands and everything in the middle of this massive big arena, and then the rooms around the edge. But then in other ways it was very different, because it's not the normal, probably more Microsoft-centric crowd, the speakers and attendees that I normally travel in the same circles with. So it's like walking around going, this looks kind of the same, but then there's all these different people to normal. But be that as it may, it was interesting. I didn't do any talks, which was super cool. It was actually nice to go to a conference and not have any talks to do. I was like, what am I going to do? Well, I can do whatever I want. So I instead went and watched a couple of other talks. I went there with my good mate Niall Merrigan. I saw Niall talk on Thursday morning. I also saw Denny de Klerk talk. Denny did a really inspirational talk with his mother. So Denny's autistic. He's been building out his own profile in the technology community for some years now. Got his first MVP award this year. He's been to places like Australia and the US and other spots around the world as a speaker, talking about, in this particular talk just yesterday, about what it was like growing up autistic and then learning to be a developer in this world. So that was super inspirational, and he got an absolute resounding standing ovation of applause at the end of it too. So good on him for that, and good on him for being brave enough to do it with his mum as well. I think that would, I did have for a moment think, what would it be like if I did that with my mother? Be very different. Anyway, so that was Javazone, that was cool. So next week I'm going off to Denmark. I'll be in Aalborg, I know I probably said that wrong, the northern bit of Denmark, on Monday, because on Tuesday I'm doing a talk at KMD Steam. All of these links are on my blog as well if you're over in Denmark way. Then on Wednesday we're going to be doing an NDC meetup, a free event in Aarhus. You know what I mean, I know I say it wrong. We'll be doing that. The one after that is going to be Thursday next week. We'll be in Copenhagen doing another NDC meetup there as well. And that will be the end of the Denmark things. Now that weekend I will then head off to Budapest, and the week which will be the 25th and the 26th of September, I'll be talking at ITBN in Hungary. That will be my first Budapest. I'm murdering these names today. Budapest trip. I'll talk more about those when I get to the weekly update next week, which will be from Copenhagen. So that's what's coming up event-wise. So still lots of stuff in Europe, although getting to slightly warmer parts of Europe, particularly as we get over to Hungary. All right, other things this week. Now, this week was a big one because Chrome 77 shipped. Now, Chrome 77 was the first, you know what, it wasn't actually the first browser, because Safari on iOS dropped the EV indicator last year. In fact, Safari on Mojave also dropped the EV indicator, because this is where we're heading now. Chrome 77 has finally dropped the EV indicator in the browser. Now, to be clear, it's dropping it from its default, what was its default position, on the address bar just to the left of the URL. So that has now gone. Firefox is going to be dropping it next month. So we're very, very quickly going to be at a point where, other than the Microsoft browsers, which, sorry to sort of face the hard facts here, do account for a very, very, very small percentage of users. So other than the Microsoft browsers, Firefox, Chrome, Safari have all killed off the company name up there next to the address bar. Now this is interesting for many reasons, not least of which is because for so long, many of us in the industry, particularly people like Scott Helm and I, have been saying that EV was, let's be clear about it, the way EV was being presented was not commensurate with the value it actually provided. Now, inevitably, this is also the view of the browser vendors because they've killed the thing off. So this whole premise of if you have an entity name up there in the address bar, people actually look at it and pay attention to it. And more specifically, they'll pay attention to when it doesn't exist, but it should exist, and they'll change their behavior accordingly. That just never happened. That's why it's dead. That hasn't stopped the browser vendors having a little bit of a scramble, I guess, to try and re-establish the value proposition of EV in lieu of not having it displayed on the browser. So there was certainly a bunch of waving of hands and gnashing of teeth in the lead up to Chrome killing this, with particularly the likes of Sectigo and Entrust Datacard saying, yeah, this is going to be a bad thing for the web, this shouldn't happen, you know, please reconsider or reverse this. Inevitably, Google just went, nah, we're doing it anyway, because it didn't make any sense in the first place, so they've killed it. Now, Entrust Datacard has put out this post. So this is the 11th of September. Title here is "The Value of EV Certificates Remains Regardless of Changes to the EV Indicator in Major Browsers." Now, one of the problems here is that regardless of who you are, commercial CA, widget seller, me with the commercial interest in something, let's say Pluralsight courses, as soon as you hear someone try to enunciate the value proposition of the thing that they are trying to sell, there's always going to be this little element of suspicion. You know, are you genuinely endorsed in these beliefs? Are you sharing something which is a sort of rational, evidence-based view of how this thing works? Or do you possibly have a bit of financial incentive clouding your views? Now, I'm very conscious of that as well. If I talk about, you know, like I said, Pluralsight courses, or if I talk about things like I get laptops from Lenovo, if I talk about that, I've got to be conscious that there is that incentive there, and how can I try and be objective about it? And no matter how hard I try and be objective, people will always jump up and say, your view is being biased by the fact that you have a commercial incentive. So, before we even get into the details of what Entrust Datacard says, that is important. It's probably also important to note that you're really not seeing many organisations or individuals out there that don't have a commercial bias coming out in favour of the value proposition of EV at all, let alone the remaining value proposition after the changes to the browser indicators. Now, I'll link to this, and you'll be able to go and have a read of this later on. But there's a section here which just... Let me just read it. So this is a bunch of bullet points about why EV still matters. Number one, EV is used by major anti-phishing services to determine safe websites. Brands with EV will still be treated as more trustworthy by browser filters. Now, this does smell a bit like bullshit when I first read it, and I had to give it some thought as to why. Now, there has been some discussion on the Twitters about how there's no evidence to support this. There has been some counter-evidence by someone who said, yes, but I can't tell you where it came from because of confidentiality, etc., which always sounds a little bit shady. But I have yet to see any evidence anywhere that says filters in browsers to try and identify what is a phishing site or what is not a phishing site will give any greater priority to an EV-based site or a site with an EV certificate. So there is well and truly debate to be had around the accuracy of that statement. But the other thing is, the more I thought about it, I realised what it is that just doesn't make sense about this. How many times has your website incorrectly been flagged as a phishing site? Now, I know for me the answer is 0. It's 0 for Have I Been Pwned, it's 0 for Terrain.com, it's 0 for any website I can think of ever been involved in before. So that the premise of a site being incorrectly flagged as a phishing site is one which I would argue is exceptionally rare. If you were to take all the websites on the web, what percentage of them do you think are incorrectly identified as a phishing site every year? What tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of 1% is it? Not too sure. It is a tiny fraction though. Ooh, just remembered something else I've got to talk about today because it's kind of hilarious along these lines, and it has to do with Scott Helm again and his revocation. I knew there was other stuff going on this week. All right, so back to the Entrust Datacard stuff. So if what they're saying, let's imagine what they're saying is true insofar as sort of filters which do identify potential phishing sites do say pay some attention to EV, the likelihood of you ever actually needing that feature is so close to 0 it's ridiculous, and then you can argue about whether or not that actually works that way or not. So it always just feels like straw man arguments when you hear these EV arguments. You'll see more of these in a moment. Straw man arguments being arguments which are really unrelated to the actual issue that we're talking about here. Number 2, organisations that have EV are well positioned well positioned for forthcoming regulations in the EU that put identity at the forefront of digital security. And then we go on about PSD2 compliance and so on and so forth. Now, identity keeps coming up time and time and time again. And this is another straw man argument, where the argument effectively goes, don't you think identity is important on the web? And everyone will go, yeah, actually identity is important on the web because that sounds like a good thing. And then the commercial CA will go, well, that's why EV is important. Now, the problem is these two don't really join together like this. So identity is important insofar as the concept of having certainty as to which parties you're communicating with is a good one. I don't debate that. It's the execution of it that is the problem. And when the execution of it was entirely dependent on users actually visually observing something and then changing their behaviour again in the absence of that thing, that just clearly didn't work. So these arguments here around identity, yes, there's good discussions to be had about identity. EV was not the answer for it though. Point 3, most browsers are still using EV indicators. Google and Mozilla will continue to use them as well. The changes will require user action to view the details provided by the EV certificates. Now this is true insofar as if you go to Chrome today, assuming you've automatically upgraded to 77, you can click on the padlock of, say, Bank of America. It'll drop down the certificate details. You can then go through and actually see that it was issued to Bank of America. So this bit is true. Now, the question to ask then is, given that EV never worked the way commercial CAs wanted it to when it was front and centre and always visible to everyone up there in the address bar, how likely do you think it is to work when you have to start drilling down on certificate details? It's not so much. Fourth point here, there's a bunch of sub-points. Identity provides the foundation for security. Does it? Not sure that it does. Citation needed. Anyway, under this, sub-bullet points. Users should be able to easily determine who they are transacting with. Yeah, but they can't, and EV doesn't do that. Sub-point 2, EV is still recognised and used as a best practice for identity verification. Again, citation needed. No, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work that way. Sub-point 3, legitimate organisations still want their identity clearly visible to their users. No, they don't. They don't. That's why a bunch of them don't even have it. There's so many examples of people actually dropping EV because it just never did what they said it would. And again, we sort of conflate these two things where if you were to ask someone like, isn't identity important? They'll go, yes, identity is important. That's one thing. If you were to say, does EV work? They'll go, no, EV doesn't work. So to then say, because the answer to the first one is yes, then EV does, it doesn't work like that. So this is really clutching at straws. And I did tweet this the other day and I said, amusingly, Entrust Data Card has just had all these bullet points about even why the indicator, or whilst the indicator is not there in the browser by default anymore, it's still valuable. By the way, go to the Entrust Data Card, go to the EV SSL page, and the very, very first thing they show you is how it's visible in the browser. And this is the thing that they focus on first. So I think that they're aware that the number one value proposition of EV, as they promoted it, is now dead. They're trying to now clutch at straws at the number 2 and number 3 value propositions and everything else. Somewhat amusingly, there's a disclaimer at the end. And look, they're a corporate. They've got to have disclaimers about all sorts of stuff. But the thing that's amusing here is in the disclaimer it says, to the maximum extent permissible or permitted by applicable law, in no event will Entrust Data Card be liable for any damages, losses or costs arising from your or any third-party actions or omissions in connection with this document. In other words, here's the document. By the way, we're not responsible for it. And look, again, I know it's like standard corporate bullshit disclaimer, but you see the irony, surely. Now, that was those guys. Different thing here, Scott. So, Scott did a blog post this week. I was waiting for this because we've been chatting about it a little bit in the lead up. I'm going to open up his blog here. I will link to it in my notes. It's the latest one on his blog at the moment. Now, Scott was doing a little bit of scanning through certificate transparency logs recently, and he found some interesting things. Now, the headline of his blog post here is Extended Validation Not So Extended. How I revoked $1 million worth of EV certificates. And what you'll see is that as you read through Scott's blog post, he found thousands of certificates, EV certificates that have been issued with incorrect information on them. Now, it's also bee season in Oslo. There's bees all over the place. So anyway, Scott's gone through, he's looking at these thousands of certificates, and he's finding things like the subject registration number fields. This is normally like the entity's registration ID, not filled out correctly in many places, 0 in many places. He's found all of these screwy things related to information that's meant to be accurate in an EV certificate, because remember, EV is meant to be identity verification. He's found all these problems and effectively identified that the certificates have been misissued. They don't have the correct information on them. So he's gone back to the issuing certificate authority and said, I would like to submit the certificate for revocation because it doesn't actually contain accurate information. The CAs have had to revoke it, and he's ended up with thousands of certificates revoked. Now he's got a list here, 3,887 certificates, and he's got a link through to a gist here that has a list of them all in case you're interested in seeing this. And this is just absolutely fascinating because remember, commercial CAs are making a couple of big claims here. So one big claim is that EV gives you identity verification, yet they've got identity information wrong on the certificate. So which is it? That's number one. Number two, there's all these assurances around EV will effectively make you more trustworthy. You'll have, some of the claims we've seen before is like greater shopping cart retention, so people are more likely to complete the checkout and everything. They never talk about the risk factors. Never talk about the risk factors of long-running expiration periods because revocation is fundamentally broken. You have a 2-year EV cert, you've got up to a 2-year window where someone can abuse the certificate. They never talk about the fact that there's so much more information that's got to go into an EV cert and that if it's screwed up, it's got to be revoked. So these thousands of certificates here that Scott's getting revoked, in each one of those instances, the CA has to reach out to the organisation that's actually running the certificate and say, look, we're really sorry, we cocked up, you need to now install a new certificate. And in fact, that's funny as well, depending on your perspective. That's funny as well because there's so many arguments about how important it is that certificate renewal should be automated using an ACME protocol like Let's Encrypt or Bypass or other commercial CAs are eventually using as well. And now we've got this situation where it's like, not only do we have to kill your certificate, but please go through the manual labour to install a new one. Also, we wouldn't have had to kill it if it was a DV because a DV never would have had this information to verify in the first place, and no one would have known the difference, especially now because EV doesn't even show up in the browser, unless you drill down. We're going to look back on this time at some stage in the future and just go, how weird was this that we used to have this EV thing? Anyway. I thought it was funny. Have a read Scott's blog post. Okay, other things. A non-InfoSec related thing, new iPhones this week. So I did watch the Apple keynote announcement, whatever we call it. The one where they do the big song and dance about all the new things. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, for phones, tablets and watches, I'm an Apple person. iPhone XS, Apple Watch Gen 4, and I've got an iPad Pro, the latest one here that I do all my other things with. And I'm also a Windows person, so I always carry 2 laptops with me. I have my desktop PC at home. I'm a bit polyglot in that way. But I do like the Apple things. And I think everyone, for years now, we've sort of been going, every time there's been a new iPhone, people are like, it's got to be revolutionary. If it's not revolutionary, we're not going to be happy with it. I don't know if the new ones are sufficiently new. Geez, lost for words. Sufficiently new or not. But I do like the idea of that iPhone 11 Pro with the good cameras, especially having better front cameras as well because I do all this stuff on the iPhone. So I think that there will be one of those in my shopping cart by the end of the day anyway, just because it is something that is like literally the basis of my daily life. And then we'll see. Maybe get some more good photos. It'd be nice to actually get home and get some more good photos of beaches because I know how much everyone loves seeing those. Deal with that later. So anyway, I'll talk about iPhone when the thing eventually arrives. New breach in Have I Been Pwned. Now, this one I find interesting, and in fact it's part of a bit of a trend recently. I'll read you the tweet from the Have I Been Pwned account. New breach, hacking site void.to had 95,000 unique email addresses exposed in June. There are actually 86,000 users plus addresses and other tables. The exposed data included email and IP addresses, usernames, private messages, and both MD5 and bcrypt password hashes. 46% of the email addresses were already in Have I Been Pwned. Now, void.to joins a number of other sites, which are hacking sites, which have been hacked. And I always wonder when I have a look at this data, particularly when there's private messages in there, and there's email addresses, and there's IP addresses, and there's usernames that people reuse, how much stuff is in there which would just be really super damaging to the people posting it. And I'm not even sure where to go from here. I kind of lament it because, you know, on the one hand, you're sort of like, geez, I hope for you folks, if you're posting stuff onto here, you're actually paying some attention to your OPSEC and not connecting over your own IP addresses and using real email addresses and things like that. On the other hand, some of the stuff some of these folks are doing well and truly deserve to have them caught as well. And I think probably the main observation out of this is this premise that you've got to assume that pretty much everything you digitise these days may one day actually be out there in public, and it may be traceable back to you regardless of how much effort you put into your anonymity. So I'm super conscious myself, not that I have an inclination to sort of go out there and do illegal things, but I'm just conscious of everything that I do digitally leaves a footprint. And there are things that I do consider about whether I want to do digitally because maybe they're not footprints I want to leave. You know, a really simple example here, and this is sort of the premise of not being able to lose what you don't have. There are lots of photos of, say, my kids that I wouldn't put on Facebook, no matter how I secure my account. Not because I don't think I should have a right to do that. I do have a right to do that, and I do have a right to privacy. But for me, I think that there's a much heightened risk that I take as soon as I digitise something. So I choose not to do that. And if I was someone spending time on a hacking forum, I would think very, very carefully about what I posted on there and what I said, regardless of how much effort I put into obfuscating my IP addresses and my handles and my email addresses and things. Just write everything like a judge is going to read it one day. I think maybe that's the best advice I can give on that. Right, so that's that one. That's the only data breach I've loaded this week. I do have 2 others at the moment I'm right in the midst of disclosure processes on. They are breaches which the organisations don't seem to know about, but there are also breaches which are circulating at the moment. Other people have sent them to me. I'm not quite sure how broadly they're circulating. They're not massive. They're not necessarily even names that you'd know, but from memory, they're both in the hundreds of thousands of records kind of range as well. So look out for those in the coming days. Now, another one here. Last thing. Garmin. So Garmin has had a data breach. And the Garmin one is kind of interesting because it's kind of an old pattern, a pattern that we've seen many times before. And the headlines are about Garmin losing, in fact, if I have a look at their disclosure notice here, they said the compromised data, and this is Garmin South Africa too, just to be clear. The compromised data was limited to only Garmin South Africa website and contained payment information, including the number, expiration date, and CVV code for your payment card, along with your first and last name, physical address, phone number, and email address. Now, that's nasty. As soon as we start getting payment cards, it's nasty. As soon as we start getting CVVs, it's even nastier again. And the initial reaction a lot of people had, and I saw this on Twitter, was, isn't the CVV the thing that you're not meant to have? You're not meant to be storing this. Why does this happen? I'll link to a story here from Bleeping Computer, and they're pointing the finger at MageCart. So if you recall, MageCart is this group that has been rather effective at effectively getting keyloggers onto other people's websites. So MageCart has been blamed for the likes of the British Airways data breach. There was, what else was there? Ticketmaster was also MageCart. And they're either getting a script onto a page somewhere because there's a vulnerable CMS, unpatched default admin creds, whatever else, or in some cases even getting their scripts into third-party services which are then embedded on the likes of the first-party website. And what ends up happening here is imagine you can run, put your MageCart hat on, imagine that you can run whatever script you want to on a website, and on that website there's payment card fields. Imagine you could write script to say, I would just like to listen to events on these fields, and as soon as the focus moves off the field, I'd like to take the value that's in that field and send it off to my own server somewhere. So what's ending up happening here is it's not data that's being, or certainly this seems to be the case with Garmin, it's not data that's being taken at rest, it's data that's being taken at the point of entry. And inevitably, if the people actually visiting the site looked at the dev tools, they'd see these async requests going off to a different domain, except of course people don't look at that stuff because people are just normal people. So this is kind of interesting to see this still happening. Garmin SA recommends all customers to review and monitor their payment cards. Yes. What else are you really going to do here? And then, of course, Bleeping Computer goes into the whole possible mage cart thing. So interesting to see that they're still being quite effective at this. Also, remember stuff like this form of attack is really easily addressed by content security policies. So this is obviously something that Scott Helm and I push a lot because we run Report URI, which is designed to do or to receive reports from the likes of content security policy violations. CSPs stop this kind of stuff dead. And obviously we have a vested interest. I talked about vested interests earlier on, but the whole premise of having a content security policy, even if you don't report to us, I'll be neutral about it, report to somewhere else. But the whole principle of having a CSP to block content being loaded from untrusted sources is really, really important. So I'd love to see more adoption of that, because every time I see a case like this, all right, A, it is good for us on Report URI because it's back in the news, but B, you're sort of looking at it going, you have free controls built into the browser that stop this stuff from happening. Why aren't you using it? Actually, I mean, the answer to why aren't you using it is usually because people just don't know. Content security policies have got somewhere in the sort of mid-single digit percentage uptakes on the world's top 1 million websites. So clearly there's a lot of gap there. Last thing also related to Garmin. In their disclosure notice, the first sentence says, "We recently discovered theft of customer data from orders placed through shop.garmin.co.za." Now, I tweeted this, and this is an honest question that I have a little bit of bias to, but it's an honest question all the same, which is whether or not theft is the right word. And the reason why I raise that is that I often see words in disclosure notices like this, either the word theft, or you'll see headlines about data stolen or something like that. And the reason I question whether it's the right word is because it doesn't deprive the original owner of the asset. And I often give an example. I had a motorbike stolen once. It was the right thing for the bike and for my livelihood and for my license, if I'm honest, but another story. Had a motorbike stolen. After the motorbike was stolen, I no longer had the motorbike. Someone else had the motorbike. I would argue that in cases like this, it is unauthorized access. It could be copyright infringement as well. It just doesn't feel like it meets a reasonable definition of theft. Now, I put the tweet out. I'll link to the tweet. There's a little bit of discussion backwards and forwards. Very polite, productive discussion too, if I may say so. Kind of arguing it both ways. Look, I guess in a way it's a bit of a semantic discussion, but it just feels a little bit wrong when I read this and says your data has been stolen. By the way, we still have your data. Why don't we just say there's a lot of globally distributed backups these days, or I don't know, something like that. So form your own opinions on that. I think theft is probably not the right word and is certainly not accurate enough. It's the same sort of discussion when we talk about copyright infringement for movies. Like, is it stealing to go and pirate a movie? It's copyright infringement. It's against the law. There are all sorts of issues with it. Is it stealing? Remember there was that, in fact, I'll link to this other blog post as well. There was that ad that ran, geez, maybe a decade ago. A very sort of sinister ad. It's like, you wouldn't steal a car, would you? And it was trying to liken pirating a movie with stealing a car. And I just remembered this morning, I did actually write a blog post about that sometime last year, effectively saying that in real life, IRL analogies often aren't very good descriptors of what is effectively like a digital crime. So, the idea of saying that pirating a movie is the same as stealing a car is really, really disingenuous. Now, just to be clear, before anyone loses their mind, this is not justifying piracy, it's not justifying hacking. I just question whether we're using the correct terms to accurately describe what actually happened. I'll link through to all those resources and make up your own mind. Okay, so that is those things. Now, last thing this week is sponsor. I've still got Okta sponsoring me this week. Last week I mentioned Okta, and I also mentioned that they created an extension which I thought was called Pass Protect. It's called Pass Protect. It is the right extension. It's a real beauty extension where every time you go to a website, enter your password, it will actually anonymize that password. It will check, have I been pwned password, and it will tell you whether it's been used before, and it will put it in a nice modal on the page. Super, super cool implementation, so check that out. This week, they're talking about rolling your own hashing algorithm. They're saying that you wouldn't roll your own hashing algorithm, so why would you roll your own auth? Secure users in minutes with a free account. And honestly, like, this is absolutely And again, I just talked about me being biased by things that I'm endorsing. But seriously, don't roll your own things. You will find many references of me having said this before Okta. But for things like Auth, if someone's out there and they're going to give you a turnkey to make this thing work, for God's sake, go and do it. There's so much stuff you can screw up writing your own Auth, let alone the fact that it actually takes time, and then you've got to maintain it, and then you're responsible for it. So Okta's really well renowned for doing what they do in terms of giving you turnkey solutions for your Auth. They're giving you a free trial, so go and give that a go if you're writing Auth. I reckon it's a good thing, regardless of my bias. All right, so that's it for this week from Norway. Next week will still be Scandinavia, but it will be a little bit further south over in Denmark. And I will update you on all the things then. See you later.